It's an amazing book. And last summer, when I was travelling all around the country during the Labour Party leadership contest, we spent hours and hours on lots and lots of trains travelling all over Britain. I read De Profundis by Oscar Wilde, because I like Oscar Wilde, but because it was something totally different to what we were doing. And I also read quite a lot about William Godwin and the Godwins and the Shelleys as a way of appreciating the struggles that people went through for their ideas. Oscar Wilde ended up in prison and wrote that brilliant ballad of Reading Gaol while he was in prison. William Godwin was tried for treason because he supported the French Revolution. And you realise the struggles people went through and the dangers they were prepared to face because of the ideas they were promoting. In no way could you say either of them was some sort of militant, military, revolutionary threat to anybody. They weren't. It was the power of their ideas that was so terrifying to the establishments of the day.
I think
you have to be calm and think about what you're doing and why you're doing it, but also recognise that public pressure, political pressure, is something you have to cope with. But real pressure is when you haven't got anywhere to live, you're going through a mental health crisis on your own, you're homeless, don't know if you're going to get into a shelter that night. That's real pressure. And I meet people all the time around the country who are leading a totally marginal existence, have no idea what their future is, and can't even think beyond tomorrow. Well, I think if we're in public life, we're paid, public life. We have expectations on us, of course, and that's correct, but also just think about the pressure other people are under, created often by the political decisions that are made.
Would you stand by those remarks?
I don't know what the remarks are because I don't buy the Sun newspaper.
Politics gave us the vote. Politics gave us the Factories Act. Politics gave us health and safety at work. Politics gave us the National Health Service. Politics gave us council housing. Politics gave us free education. And politics, properly engaged with, can build those houses that young people need, can get those jobs that young people need, can lift the burden of debt on young people, can care for our elderly, can create a society where we care for each other and everybody cares for everybody else. Walking away leaves it to the cruelty of the free market.
I would prefer that all our children have opportunities to grow up in the company of other children, whether they be rich or poor. That is what brings about a coherent and cohesive society. The exclusivity in education and exclusivity of so much in our society is what leads to an awful lot of our social class distinctions.
But I tell you this, if we allow ourselves and our politics to be demeaned and reduced to the level of personal abuse, which you then reply to, you've simply got into exactly the same gutter as they inhabit themselves. I'm not going there, I'm not doing that, we're not going there, and we're not doing that. And doing other things is important, so going to a park, digging your garden, reading a book. It's all important because you've got to keep a balance in your life. If you don't keep a balance in your life, you end up a bit unbalanced. The mighty eventually tumble. I first went to Chile in 1969 as a young man, hitchhiking around Latin America. And I joined the May Day March in Santiago in that year, summer 1969, when the Popular Unity movement was growing and fought the 1970 election, and Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile. He did his best to try to close the ghastly gap between the rich and the poor and try to bring about a better society. The coup took place in 1973. Pinochet came to power, and thousands disappeared and thousands died, and there's still unmarked graves to be found in Chile. And he once memorably said, "Not a blade of grass moves in Chile without my approval." And then, after the big change in Chile in 1990, I was there for that. It was called the Cambio de Mano, change of hand. There was then the development of a human rights movement, and then I remember he came to London on an arms buying mission, and to his credit, Balthazar Gazan managed to get an extradition warrant approved from Spain, and he was arrested in London. Pinochet arrested in London in a hospital by a British policeman. It was an astonishing moment, and we then mounted a huge campaign to ensure that he had to face justice. And eventually, quite disgracefully, he was allowed to go back to Chile on spurious medical grounds. And I was very angry about this. He'd been 500 days under house arrest in Britain. I then went to Chile at the invitation of the committee that disappeared. And I was very angry about it all. But we had a Human Rights Day rally at the Villa Grimaldi, which was the torture centre in Santiago. And I stood there with Michelle Bachelet, who's now the president of Chile, and we both spoke to the crowd there about the need for solidarity around the world and how the mighty tumble. And because of the solidarity of the people of Chile in bringing about that change, in getting rid of Pinochet, and his ultimate arrest, he was diminished and demeaned, and a form of democracy has returned to Chile. How the mighty tumble. Solidarity actions, they always seem hopeless at the time, absolutely hopeless at the time, but eventually it happens. Unite together around those basic demands of justice, peace, democracy and human rights. We're a very, very powerful force. When we link up with other people doing exactly the same thing, in Greece, in Spain, in Portugal, in Italy, in Tunisia, in many, many other countries all around the world, that's what makes our movement the force for good, the force for democracy, the force for the environment, and the force for peace in the world. Thank you very much.
So when an issue happens anywhere in the world, obviously I read all the briefings that have been given, obviously I follow the news and information, but also I quite often know people in different places around the world, so I call them up, ask what's happening. And around my community around here, there's a very diverse community, often people know people in different parts of the world. Having an understanding of the world is quite important for any political party, and very important that we understand the human level as well as the mega political level, because at the end of the day we're all human beings. I've talked to people in Thanet and many other places who voted UKIP. I've had some quite interesting discussions with them, and they said things like, well, if Labour stood up for us, working class people, then we'd vote for it. And so yes, of course we can move people back. There has to be a process of political education, political activity, and giving people hope. If all you offer is austerity light, well, it's not much of a choice. I think we have to look at ourselves and say, what kind of society are we in when we penalise people for being educated? Because if somebody is a good engineer, somebody is a good lawyer, somebody is a good doctor, a good surveyor, all the other things that are so important, we all benefit. If it's a good doctor, we benefit. You know the reality. Education is not just for the individual, education is for the society as a whole.